Nicola Masciandaro, thank you very much for joining me on once again on Hermitix. It's been a long time.
Thank you.
We are going to be discussing the life and work of, at this point, let's just say, an Indian spiritual master called Meher Baba, who he said that he was the avatar of God in human form of the age, a key spiritual figure of the 20th century, known in terms of his books for God Speaks and his discourses, and God Speaks is understood by his followers and, let's say, disciples, yeah, definitely disciples, as scripture, it seems, for some, maybe. Um, but so that's who we're going to be talking about, and we're also going to be touching on his theories to do and his ideas to do with consciousness, love, karma, heaven, hell, and everything a good spiritual master usually comments on. But the reason I emailed you about Meher Baba is that I think in our original chat back when I used to do the Hermetics question, one of your figures was Meher Baba, but also every time I see your Twitter crop up, it's usually a quotation. And I said before we start recording, I noticed that kind of obsession. So I feel like Meher Baba has become important for you, more than just a thinker.
Definitely. Yeah. My interest in Meher Baba goes back to when I was about 15. Um, and my mother had been given a Baba card, a little card with Meher Baba's picture, probably said, "Don't worry, be happy" on it or something. And I said, "Oh, who's that?" And she said, "Well, someone who says he is God." And my immediate response was, "Well, that's exactly what God should look like."
Yeah.
Just blurted out this, I love the story because it's like I'm the authority on, what God should look like. Um, and then it was, yeah, but I had no interest at the time, no conscious interest, at least in spirituality or religion, or I just wanted to rock climb and have fun. And there was another book in the house at some point that my mother was becoming interested in Meher Baba, and somebody had loaned her this book that was kind of a coffee table style book, almost, called Love Personified: Pictures of Baba. I remember on the back it said, "I never come, I never go, I'm never born, I never die." And it was just, but looking at Baba's pictures actually was there was just, I guess I had an experience of recognition, um, of some kind of recognition and attraction to Meher Baba. And then subsequently I started reading, and I remember in high school I read his discourses really thoroughly, and met some other people in the Seattle area who were, there was a little Baba group that would meet at people's houses once a month and drink tea and to talk about Meher Baba things. So yeah, that's how I kind of came to Meher Baba. And then subsequently in my scholarly and intellectual work, I just integrated his text into my thinking, and there is, I guess, in intellectual circles the kind of there's a kind of boundary, right, between mysticism and philosophy or spirituality. It's always, and usually it's kind of guarded by religious identity. People who have a religious identity or culture or affiliation. That's the sort of conduit for quoting, let's just say, spiritual teachers of one kind or another without, as authorities
Mm-hmm.
rather than just as examples of some historical phenomenon. But in literary studies, I mean, we quote all these people, French philosophers especially, and it's like, why can't we work with whoever else we want to work with? I mean, so that's been an interesting process of years and years of just reading and rereading Meher Baba's works, and in the studying medieval literature and seeing so many points of intersection, I guess, between what we consider kind of traditional mysticism and so that's a little bit of a background in my own personal.
I guess Baba is an interesting case, a fairly unique case there, because if you take any of the other modern mystics, I mean, you could even put Jung in there, but Jung, Gurdjieff, Steiner, they are seen largely just as human beings who are mystical and scholarly, and so their authority is easy to be questioned. Whereas Baba's, I guess, when you're quoting Baba's authority as well, this guy did say he was the avatar of God, which is a different form of authority altogether. But it also, I guess, we talk about using French philosophers, or we talk about using medieval mystics. It does also bring about the question of what is that expanse of time that needs to pass where you can now just use someone's work and say, well, it's survived the test of time, whether it's a cloud of unknowing or whoever. Maybe it's that recency thing where we're a bit more.
Yeah, it's just social conventions and things. But regarding Baba's statement that he's the avatar, I mean, he also obliterates the distinction between God and man, and says absolutely that we're all that. So there's a lot of interesting qualifications that I think would need to be added to that claim, and how to read the claim, and what he says about the claim. He absolutely denies being a saint or a holy person in his message from the 50s, which is when he started to state publicly that he was God in human form. He states, well, I'm either an ordinary human being or I'm the highest of the high, and so that's interesting. And regarding, I just wanted to, I had a note that of one passage that I think was a good example of what I'm talking about regarding his claim.
Sorry, I should have said about the claim. I've made you jump ahead in your.
No. I think this is very interesting, and it's absolutely critical. He says, when I say I am the avatar, there are few who will feel happy, some who will feel shocked, and many who, hearing me claim this, would take me for a hypocrite, a fraud, a supreme egoist, or just mad. If I were to say every one of you is an avatar, a few would be tickled, and many would consider it a blasphemy or a joke. The fact that God, being one, indivisible, and equally in us all, we can all be naught else but one, is too much for the duality conscious mind to accept. Yet each of us is what the other is. I know I am the avatar in every sense of the word, and that each of you is an avatar in one sense or the other. So the way I receive that statement has everything to do with, well, who else is there to be? I mean, who else? The human in some ways wants something else to define itself against. To be human is to not be God, or to be God is to not be human, which is, Meher Baba was extremely critical, especially in his early phases of his life in the 20s and 30s, of extremely critical of formalized religion. He talks about of all religions, which of all, and priest class. He talks about the piles of stone which keep us from God and that sort of thing. So that separation of the human and the divine is something that he's
Okay. Let's jump back, because that connection, like that notion of what even is the avatar, or what even is the God man, when you're speaking from what might be classically called a Advaita non-dual perspective, which seems absolutely is there for maybe that could be the foundation when we get to the thought. But I want to jump back to, because people might be wondering, okay, we're suddenly talking about this guy who said he was, or has this relationship to, he's a spiritual guy,
Mhm.
spiritual master, possible avatar. People are bowled over when they first meet him, to many to the point of tears, many to the point. It seems one of the common things I read was that people wanted to immediately hug him and embrace him. And yet, for a large part of his life, for 45 years of his life, this is a master who is completely silent. So, who is this strange man? To skip his very early childhood, this seems to begin when he's 19, and it lasts for roughly 7 years, and he meets the major figures for this transformation are Hazrat Babajan, Upasni Maharaj, Sai Baba of Shirdi, Tajuddin Baba, and Narayan Maharaj, who are five, I'm going to just very quickly use the word saint figures,
Mhm.
who are guides, but also it seems just, this is just using metaphor, vessels of transmission. They are, so one in particular, which I believe is Hazrat Babajan, did she kiss him on the head?
Mhm.
And he goes
Yes, when he
into
was
a
19.
19, yeah, he gets kissed on the head by Babajan and goes into a 9-month state of ecstatic bliss, which I believe he refuses. He doesn't want to leave, right? And that's why it turns into a strange, was that,
Well,
okay.
yeah, I mean, as I follow and remember the story, he that's the moment that he Baba said that he experienced God realization. Um and but the problem, so to speak, from that point is how to integrate that knowledge of oneself as God with your ordinary consciousness. So for many months, Baba was like kind of like an automaton. This is also the period when he used to bang his head on the stone in his room. Um, and so these five uh, saints or holy persons whom you mentioned are identified by Baba as perfect masters, as God realized humans. It makes a distinction between human individuals who attain God realization and then the avatar, which is like the God man as opposed to man God, like the descent, which is what the word avatar means, the descent of God into human form. They
So what? Sorry,
kind
what
of
was the
effectuate.
what's the difference between those two?
Um, well, the difference is, I guess it has to do with individuality, although it's a little murky. There are some passages in God which discuss the avatar as the first soul, as sort of Adam as the first avatar, not literally historically, but Adam as the first soul to complete the whole process that's figured behind me on this chart of evolution and involution, that every individual soul, who is none other than God, um, completes this journey of the soul. So, who is the avatar? The avatar is either, in some sense, um, the first being, who then returns, sort of age after age, or is a direct descent of God into human form. But again, also Meher Baba criticizes the anthropocentric notion of the avatar, which I think is really important, particularly in our moment. Um, the idea of just a human, divine human savior. He talks about the avatar as the universal appearance of God throughout creation, and that this appearance happens at all levels of existence and life and reality and all the different kingdoms, animal kingdom, vegetable kingdom. So that's also interesting. But anyway, he makes a distinction between perfect masters, of whom he states, in God Speaks, that there are always five on this planet Earth at any given moment, who effectively who sort of call down the avatar, and these would be historically figures like John the Baptist. Um, but yeah, and then the avatar himself is is God in human form, but also uh, there's what is that individuality? It's this also the self of all. You know,
Mhm.
it's so you just have to accept some kind of fundamental paradox when you're talking about who anyone is. If all are one, all are God, then who is there, to be? Who is who? Yeah.
Yeah. And so to jump back, he's banging his head.
Hmm. Yeah, you want to get back to the biography. That's
Sure, sorry.
yeah. And he has encounters and with these other persons. Upasani Maharaj, Sai Baba throws a stone at him and things like this, and calls him Parvardigar, and or maybe it was Upasani Maharaj that threw the stone. I may be mixing things up, but within a few years, by 2021, early 20s, Baba's recognized by some people as a master.
Mm. And does that immediately, is this very much to bring in someone such as Christ? Is there moments of, you know, um, come with me and be fishers of men, and of people seeing Baba and just following him in that immediate
Yeah,
recognition sense?
yeah. I think the Ramju's diaries are a really good source for those early days. Baba established a house where his close followers lived, communally, called Manzili Mim, the house of M, the house of the master. And they, shared their resources and undertook different kinds of spiritual discipline and projects. They also worked on on the publication of a biography of Upasani Maharaj that has recently been translated and published. So yeah, and then Baba, as you said before, Baba's life is marked by all of these phases and shifts and projects, and building something and then abandoning it, or dissolving it and then moving on to another kind of work. But that's at least we're started filling in a few pictures of the story, but it's quite. I just want to say one thing. Yeah, if you look at the chronology of Baba's life, which is nicely compiled on the online bibliography called Lord Meher, the activity level of Meher Baba is kind of frightening. It's and to consider that he did everything that he did, all these different forms of work, and on top of that, fasting and being in seclusion, all kinds of things like this, while silent, for 44 years, speaking through alphabet board, then later his own invented sign language, and also not writing, or very infrequent, almost not using a pen either. It's quite amazing to conceive what that kind of activity is.
Yeah, I mean, and it was, you mentioned the amount of activity. It was intriguing and kind of humorous to read the Hopkinson biography, because all the while he is he has this relationship with poverty, a very direct relationship with being, existing in poverty, of existing among the poor, of the poorest. And there's this point where he dismantles one of his ashrams, and this is all very vague because this seems to happen quite a few times, but it's quite humorous because he says, anyone who follows me now, this will be even more like, and you think, how can he get any more sort of frugal? And then it ends up, I think he says, we're now going to be begging for our food.
That's in the new life. Yeah. Yeah.
So always has this relationship. He's always living in the strictest poverty. Seems to be sleeping about 1 to 4 hours a night. And then these, as you said, these periods of seclusion, of fairly extreme fasting, of I think he has to be might be thinking of someone else, but I'm thinking of another Maharaj actually. But not intaking much food. I mean, it's very sort of classic behavior of a of a spiritual figure. And then, as you said, 1925, 10th of July, I've got it in my notes, 10th of July, 1925, he begins this silence and says a very elusive thing that about one day I will break my silence with a word. But I guess before we get to that elusive thing, which I'm sure haunts all people interested in Baba, what do you make of him becoming silent in the first place? And then as you said, there's these phases. So it becomes silent, uses an alphabet board, and then eventually it's gestures, which people have said that just like a hand movement to, I can't remember who it is, who is sort of translating his gestures. There is a key follower, I think.
Erich Jasapala was the main, but everybody who lived with Baba could follow his gestures just by exposure to them. And but anyway.
So what do you make of, I guess.
What do I make of?
The silence.
Well, because you also mentioned poverty and kind of, what might sound like asceticism. I do feel like it's important to state that Bob always maintained that his this was all part of his work for humanity, his as opposed to traditional asceticism, which is about chastening, the flesh, and the silence likewise. Now he gave different kinds of explanations for his silence, and it's a little difficult to talk about Baba's silence without drifting off into just thinking about silence itself, and what it is. But I think, in terms of his silence, the quality of Meher Baba's silence, one thing that's important is, kind of related to the activity level, is that it was common for people to be around Baba and not notice his silence, and not feel that there was an absence of speak, that rather he was very, very present, very speaking. You can see movies where he's obviously very affectionate and very, his body is full of, very expressive, and his physical expressions and so forth. So that's interesting. That and he also said that he's always speaking. He's always speaking. So, and the other thing that he connects his silence with is the problem of living or failing to live the words of truth. He famously said, "I've had enough of words, and you've had enough of words." So it's also a kind of challenge, to a spiritual challenge, to be honest and to be real. He said things that are real are given and received in silence. So silence is a kind of language, and also reminds me of something about God Speaks. He said it has the status of scripture, which, I wouldn't dispute that, I guess. Devotees of Baba tend to take everything that Baba says. It's like with authority. But Meher Baba also said really clearly that this book was written to sort of satisfy, I'm not sure if I got the words exactly right, but to satisfy the intellectual convulsions of the human mind. That this is, it's expressly like an intellectual account of what, in God Speaks, it says God cannot be understood. God can only be lived. And so that distinction between intellectual comprehension and experiential, life, experiential realization, is just fundamental to everything that how Baba lived, and how he and what he said regarding the spiritual life. So the silence is a part of that embodiment of the principle.
I was going to say there's an irony regarding God Speaks, full title. God Speaks, the theme of creation and its purpose. So this is 55, and this is, what's the word? Transcribed via the alphabet board. But there's an irony.
It's actually dictated. One of the texts dictated, letter by letter.
You mentioned that in it says that God, God can't be understood. But the irony there is that it's kind of now known as one of these spiritual works, which is like the most intricate and articulate on maybe not necessarily God, but the let's say the divine creative process. I mean, it goes into
It's hard to.
detail.
I mean, you've read probably more theology than I have. Is there anything comparable in terms of like process theology, or, I mean, especially, I mean, from the 20th century as a statement that a vision of,
I mean, if you want to try
of evolution and cosmology, it's like,
I possibly, if you wanted to try decipher it because it's cryptic and it's meant to do something to you hypnotically, would be Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is like 1,000 pages, and he also dictated that like 3 times over and just caused headaches for all his followers. Maybe, but that cosmology is, you sort of have to like figure out what in the world is actually going on. But in terms of something so almost, I mean, this is very common for this era as well. Of this as a God speaks as the feeling of a science, of a that meeting of mysticism and science. This thing you mentioned of Baba saying that it's there to scratch our very Western intellectual need. So I wonder if that's a factor as well, of that need. And ultimately we're talking about the 50s. It's not long ago.
It's interesting too. The title is often, I think, generally thought of. It's understood by people as like, this is the word of God. God speaks. Like, God is now speaking and explaining like stuff. But the other sense of the title is just God speaks. The divine talks. Like, it's I think it has everything to do with the way Meher Baba explains the nature of life, which is also something that's understood by phenomenologists like Michel Henry. Like, life has a verbal structure. Life is both what it says and it is the saying of itself. It's manifestation. So I think I just think that's an important aspect of that book, because the cosmology is also, what drives life, what drives the universe, what drives the evolution of consciousness is this, as Meher Baba explains it, is a dialectical process, which is rooted in, you mentioned before, spontaneity, this whim to know oneself. The question, who am I, is what brings everything into being, or everything as we experience the external world. And that's a speaking,
But to have that question, who am I as a human being, we're already quite far along on the process, right?
Sorry, say that again.
Well, to have that question, who am I?
Yes,
as a human being, we're quite far along on the process for Baba.
As humans,
yeah,
in the sense that consciousness is, as he explains it, consciousness is full and complete, and the phenomenon that sort of constitutes this is just the is like the cogito. It's like the human ego, which knows that it is. I think in the discourses, for example, when he's talking about the origins of the ego, evolutionary origins, which is necessary because you need like a center, you need a zone of integration of experience, right? You can't just for consciousness to develop. But he says, a dog will feel anger, but it does not remain in a state, I am angry. But by the time we get to the human, we have this sort of sense of an I, but that's also the medium and the condition for the full development of consciousness. The problem, so the human is sort of the terminus of the the external, we might say, or physical evolution of forms. But the human carries with it the burden of the whole evolutionary history, and then gets caught up in its own sort of self-made world. But it's the U-turn in terms of, it's like a Neoplatonic circle.
Where have we been before that? Because we've been
Yeah.
Baba's. One of the more intriguing things about Baba is sort of, it seems quite literal that we have
Mhm.
whatever that we is, because once
Yeah.
again, the non-dual aspect muddies all of this whole idea of individuality. We've gone through, am I right thinking every form of we've been every fish, we've been every rock. So there's like rocks, metals, vegetable,
Mhm.
animal, even like,
Yeah.
he talks
Yeah.
about being every type of worm before we've,
Yeah. It's like kind of a chain of being, right?
but
But it's
extremely
not.
intricate.
Mhm.
I mean, someone like Thomas Aquinas would say, mineral, rock, animal, man, angel, archangel, or whatever. But Baba is here talking about that we individually, it seems, this is my reading, we individually have been through sort of every iteration or species of worm before so quite literally is it that we've had to expand and develop our consciousness to every possible level before that of the human?
Um, yeah, I guess so. I mean, the idea is that the evolution of forms, which we understand through, biology and so forth, is the evolution of consciousness. It's driven by the evolution of consciousness.
Mm.
So, in Baba's account, there's no being without life in this sense, if we think of life as consciousness. So you could say this like non-biological life. And I guess it would be like a panpsychist perspective in some general way. But in terms of individuality, this is where it's very interesting. He says that individual lives or souls are generated through this whim. The word is based on it's a Marathi word, or has a Sanskrit root, lahar, which means both wave and whim.
Mm.
This whim of God or eternal reality to know itself. It's like an ocean that then gets stirred up,
Mm.
and these individuals are. There's an expression in the discourses, the innumerable frothy selves. I love this idea. Um, so life is individualized from its origin in this sense, at the beginning, and that the entire scope of cosmic evolution is constituted by the evolution of individuals. So
Mm.
this, of course, is a huge problem for science and philosophy. How come I'm human? How
Mm.
come? I mean, it's a problem of individuation. What kind of cause could there be for one's own individual humanness? We might, in some loose sense, think of as opposed to something else, or
Mm.
whatever. But we're in line. We seem to be in this huge line. How do we account for our position in this line? And yeah, so Meher Baba integrates reincarnation with evolution. Um,
Mm.
but he also talks about the nature of God, or the one, as always also individualized. He says that the one is simultaneously a series of ones within the one.
I mean, this goes back. I mean, this is very
Yeah.
much non-dual. Goes back to how
Yeah.
many non-dual thinkers would often use the symbol. Let's say symbol. And I want to emphasize that it is, because they always emphasize it's a symbol. It's a metaphor. The ocean, right? The ocean.
Yeah.
If we speak only from the ego, we believe that we are a wave that is somehow separate from the ocean. And
Mm-hmm.
so the evolutionary process, is this the same for Baba, would be to come to the point where one, that is the individual, dissipates or disconnects from the bondage of the ego to such a degree, well, not to such a degree, because there is no degree, it's when it gets all murky,
Mm-hmm.
that they realize they're a wave of the ocean. That was always the case, and that was always going to be the case, which then you end up in this strange struggle of how does evolution, which does have a direction, relate to the oneness of non-duality, which seems to be the
Mhm.
foundation for Meher Baba.
Yeah, and Meher Baba says very clearly that individuality is retained after God realization, that there's no, it's not that the drop then merges in the ocean as if it was never, as if it becomes nothing.
Mm-hmm.
What becomes nothing is the separation or the, I know you're interested in Meher Baba's humor. He also quite humorously said, when I realized my oneness with God, or I forget the exact phrase, I lost everything except my sense of humor.
It's a classic response, right? It's a classic
Yeah.
response is to laugh at enlightenment
Mm.
because it always is what was anyway. So you're laughing
Mhm.
at this strange absurdity. Not that I'm speaking from the position of anyone who's enlightened, but from everything I've read, that is the realization is nothing because you are of the ocean.
Yeah, you're already what you are. I mean, that's hence like Nietzsche's imperative is exactly what uh, Baba follows. You become what you are, and that's why it's so difficult. But just in terms of sort of Meher Baba's metaphysics and his understanding of nature and God, if you will, this is across his works very clearly. I mean, he talks about individuals as souls,
Mm-hmm.
right? Souls are divine selves. They're God, but they're like individualized God, if you will. The soul doesn't need anything to know itself. But in order to become conscious of itself, it has to move from a sleep state or an unconscious state. He talks about God as unconscious or beyond, beyond God, the God that wakes up into the universe,
Mm-hmm.
has to experience this limitation of identification with a physical body, um, a subtle body, a mental body. So it's a kind of 3+1 structure. There's a gross world, a material world. There's a subtle world, which is the domain of energy. There's a mental world. Um, but the soul really doesn't do anything. The soul, when it identifies with the mind, it's the mind that thinks. The mind is like a machine; it does its thing. It identifies with that, and then it thinks that it is thinking. When it identifies with the body, it thinks that it is the body.
Mm-hmm.
I am moving, I am talking.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, the sovereign soul is just sort of there. It's
Just
just,
I am.
yeah.
Just
Um,
amness. The
yeah, and
self-foundness.
everything has come out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's this sort of irony. I mean, there's this Baba would sometimes spontaneously produce these lovely little rhymes, one of which is, um, uh, "Oh, you all-knowing soul, what a plight you are in." Um, um, what a it's see if I can remember the whole thing, but anyway, he says it ends up with this paradox that the all-powerful soul is experiencing limitation. What a plight! And he says, "What a sight! What a delight!" You know. Um, so that's
we had to be kicked out of Eden to metaphorically understand Eden. Like you need to.
Oh, it's a question whether we had to or not.
Mm.
There is this passage in, I mean, there's different ways that Baba describes this lahar or whim, which by definition cannot be understood if it's what it is.
Mm.
But, yeah, you can see it as this sort of harmonic, beautiful process whereby God, knows himself. But at other times, Baba describes it as a kind of lust.
Mm.
Like he gives in to like it's a weakness or something. And he also talks about it as a mistake. like, so there's this passage I have in front of me from Everything and the Nothing, called The Jest on My Chest, where he says, as the highest of the high, I'm the wisest of the wise, yet I have allowed myself to perform an act more foolish than any fool ever would. What is this foolish act? Creating the creation. Creation is really a mighty joke, but the laugh is at my own expense, and now the jest is proving a burden on my chest. And is like, how could I have done this? That is why I say you have no idea what I mean when I say that I am tired. It is beyond human understanding. So we get a kind of a different picture of the system of nature.
We messed up. Someone messed up big time somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful and it's funny and it's tragic too. But there's no real tragedy because everything's perfectly okay forever.
Yeah, I mean the only tragic, well, maybe not tragedy, would be so hang on, just before we get to tragedy, I was going to bring in heaven and hell, but it's not really tragic. It's sort of a case of responsibility. I want to bring in, I guess, with regard to these souls. I mean, Ramesh Balsekar, actually, he talks about in Non-Dual. He talks about the non-duality of beingness as a net of jewels. So they're each shining, but each reflects the other to be the whole non-dual thing. So this seems to be close to what we're talking about with these souls. But for Meher Baba, the relationship between God and man isn't strictly, let's say, like Abrahamic. It's not like God is there and then you're all just sort of in obedience. It's a reciprocal relationship. God needs man as much as man needs God. So man is sort of doing this work for God, but it doesn't have that relationship where God already is and man is simply trying to get somewhere. That there is work to be done for both. Like God is reliant on man seems to be what how I understood it. Maybe I'm incorrect.
Well, here the text that comes to mind is one that I guess could be compared to the famous Hadith of the Hidden Treasure. Do you know that in Islamic Sufism, quoted by Ibn Arabi and so forth? But the idea is that, God is love. And Baba says, love must love, but to love there must be a beloved. But since God is existence infinite and eternal, there is no one for him to love but himself. And in order to love himself, he must imagine himself as the beloved, whom he, as the lover, imagines he loves. So imagination, which is the universe, all that is the shadow of God, is the medium for this game of love to take place, which also involves the suffering of separation. But the separation is the condition for union. So it's more like, I mean, you see this in, Sutta Dionysus, this kind of eros of creation. Is the sense also in Meister Eckhart that, God, and, also in Eriugena, I guess it's a Neoplatonic thing that, God is not the creator, but the God becomes God through creating something other than God. In this case, it's the lover of the beloved, So,
yeah, I mean, the Hindus would say was it Leela, the great cosmic dance.
Yeah,
Seems
I mean,
for the sake of, and then that's where the laughter is, because I guess that unification is all just to get back to that which one already was. That was good fun.
Yeah, and the idea is that it is a manifestation or speaking, or it's the play. I mean, it's like, what is culture? Culture is the life playing with itself, exploring its capacities, seeing what it can do, generating, in a sense, increasing its being. When you acquire a capacity, you look what I can. Cultural forms develop, and there's no end to their. It's not like culture is just going to exhaust itself and then stop and say, okay, we have enough. Yeah. It's going to go on developing itself, and that's nature. That's the evolution of the universe. It's an experimentality to existence. That's not. Yeah, you could say it's futile and a joke and absurd, which it is. At the same time, it's somehow allowing for, yeah.
It makes me wonder if there's an inverse direction though for Baba, something akin to sin. If we're talking about imagination and perhaps play as this direction or spontaneity of being with God's whim, is there an inverted direction where someone is? I mean, what is it to not be imaginative? He's stuck. I mean, is that the equivalent of sin or something like that? Is there something that's kind of butting its head against this process, that is against this will to seek?
That's a good question. I mean, Meher Baba doesn't talk about sin as such, and he doesn't talk about ethics in terms of morality, except in a practical sense, like it's good to, moral education is helpful for people and things like that. But but I would say it's the three sins are like sort of anger, greed, and lust. And these have to do, these are habits or, the result of impressions of experience on the self, the psychological self. But I would say selfishness, separateness, these are the things that Meher Baba continuously is like wanting to break down. He really, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article about Meher Baba's fashion and style. Like he really didn't like, kind of distinctive forms of dress, any kind of like people that would separate themselves out from other people. Of course, he had followers from all different faiths, but any kind of exclusiveness, any kind of separativeness is something that he really, so that kind of hardened ego that says, no, I am me and I'm not you. I mean, he's continuously affirming that there's this infinite individuality, it's not, so I guess he's standing against both collectivism and individualism, because there's this divine unity that is the unity of individuals, that's the seriality of the one. And so, there's plenty of room for the play of differences, but there's also a kind of intolerance of any sort of difference that would reify itself and say, like, I'm higher than you or lower than you. And so, like, things like caste, he was completely against, he said explicitly that all these categories of race and class and nationalism, these are all going to be destroyed. These are all false ideas. And just as we know scientifically, they have no basis. Anyway, so I guess that we're talking about sin. It's just that sort of form of egoism that has to do with asserting separateness. Because the inner worlds of life and the outer world are actually not separate. I mean, we sort of live on the boundary or in the space of interpenetration, but the ego, as it develops, and it's sort of part of a necessary result of its development, it introduces a separation between the outer world and the inner world, between myself and yourself, which is, as I understand, it's necessary for intelligence to work and being able to navigate the natural world and survive and things like that. But when the ego becomes hardened and fixed, right? He talks about, of course, it's related. The ego is sort of constituted, it's sort of rooted in the mind, in the individual mind, is constituted by sort of attachment and desires. And he says, he uses the expression the self becomes self-hypnotized. So that would be like a kind of state of sin, if you will. It's also just a state of sleep, or a
Yeah.
kind of narcissistic. Um, you get to the point where you could, the only things you can understand are stories where you have a part of that. It's like,
We're not far from that in the
yeah.
West. I mean, that's
Oh,
all our stories.
yeah. I remember. Have you ever seen that film Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch?
No, no.
Yeah. Native American asks this cowboy named, well, he's not quite a cowboy, but anyway, characters, do you have any tobacco? And he says, I don't smoke. It's like, and he says, like, stupid white man. Because it's like, he's not answering the question. He's just, he's inserting himself into this picture. It's having to put this this ego in front of every,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we could talk more about the ego later.
Mm.
Um, but he actually also talks about evil as the relic of good, and also the good or virtue is also has to be overcome, and it's kind of even harder to overcome attachment to the good as the opposite of evil, because it seems like it's not a limitation. He uses the metaphor of golden chains.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the evil as a
Yeah.
relic of good, because it's probably one of the most at least seemingly the most controversial idea by Baba that I forgot to mention, put it down, and I'm glad you reminded me of it, which is that he believes that every single thing is at least a shade of good. Everything is good.
But in this super essential way, it has no opposite. I mean, God, reality, truth is beyond good and evil.
Mm-hmm. So it's all,
But
by good. Then it's sort of in the sense that one might have, even torturous, painful, ego-shattering, miserable moments. That is a good in the sense of this grand evolution of consciousness.
yeah, I mean, I think he talks about, again, kind of like Nietzsche's Amor Fati, trying to see things as necessary. I mean, the operation of what he describes as impressions or sanskaras, which is related to what we call karma, the logic of experience, this sort of subtle forces whereby if you kill someone, you will be later disposed to put yourself in a situation of being killed, because you have to sort of unite with the opposite of that experience. Yeah, I mean, he describes these things in terms of a kind of laws of cause and effect, and as opposed to, as I say, a sort of moral, like there's a rule, and then if you don't live up to the rule, you failed. No, there's, but I guess a good example is where he talks about selfishness and selflessness in the discourses. Where they're both forms of egoism. It's just that one is more restricted, and then selflessness is like you've expanded the scope of the ego. So, or the love, he gives an example, the love of a parent for their child. There's a kind of selflessness. You're going to sacrifice yourself, but there's still a tremendous selfishness. I mean, the father is not going to just help anybody on the street in a homeless person, but when it's his son, he's going to pull out all the stops. And likewise, still my baby, So the divine life, I guess, it transcends that, and is selfless in a way that's also, recognizes the godhood of each individual. I think this is really important in a time of extreme quantification that Mayor Baba talks about, in terms of what he calls the spiritual infinity of the truth. Every individual has the value, so to speak, of the totality.
Is that possible? Is that possible for all of us within our current lifetime? For him?
Possible in which sense? I mean, it's just.
To be, what is it? God realized, I think, is the term he uses.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, he does. In places, he says it seems like it. There's this number thrown around about 84 lakhs or 8,400,000 human lifetimes. But then he says every human incarnation, if you will, every human life is an opportunity. And he says, if you are extra circumspect about it. I really love that expression, extra circumspect. So yes, God realization, but it's also, and you see this a lot among Meher Baba's close disciples and their experiences with people coming to Baba wanting God realization, like, please give me realization. That, yeah, God realization is not, I mean, it's the goal, and it's also not the goal. It's also like totally irrelevant. I don't know.
Well, it's a paradox, and it's the opposite of that, right? Because to say like, give me God realization is the self-same grasping that one's ego needs to not. But equally, as you said, with selfishness, like grasping, selflessness, there's still a self in the word, right? So like, what I guess what is it to have that final realization or the God realization is, well, what faculties do you even have to deal with that? You don't have the mind.
Well, you don't need a mind, as I understand. The soul it's all immanent to the soul.
It's all love.
Yeah, and
sorry, every sort of throwing it there.
and all other attributes and possibilities and powers and things. So yeah, but I mean, one can go on. I mean, Baba describes the experiences of people on the inner planes, like those of, we call saints, or in the case of musts or God intoxicated individuals, and give some intimation of those kinds of experiences. But that's just a more beautiful illusion. And again, when you talk to the people that live with Meher Baba, they don't go on and about all this esoteric spiritual stuff. They just want to be with Baba.
They just want to be with him? Or do they want to, is there anything that he advised people to do? Obviously there's the charity work, but was there, what typically ashrams have, like, people are usually meditating or yeah.
Baba would give individual instructions to people, but it wasn't an he'd never, I mean, at different times of life, he had different kinds of projects, and he had a school, for example, for young boys, and in Nagar, and free medical dispensary, and there's kind of institutional types of projects, but no, in general, there was no like, and there were rules and orders and things that would be given to people, particularly during their new life. People would, if people were coming with him and renouncing everything, they had to do that. But there was no program. Meher Baba explicitly said, I lay down no precepts. And again, honesty, I will go on and on about the emphasis upon honesty, as the one of the most central and important ideas that, especially regarding like what people supposedly believe about Meher Baba. He's just, whatever you feel is true, say it. If you think I'm the devil, say I'm the devil. If you think I'm God, say I'm God. It doesn't matter.
Why do you think that
dogmas?
Why do you think that honesty is so key?
Because honesty is discipline of eliminating falsehood. I don't think we can access the truth as something like we can arrive at it by thinking, and it can never, there's no limit on what is true or might be true. It can't be brought within the bounds of definition. But it can be experienced by the elimination of falsehood and deception and limited concepts, limit definitions. Once you call something X, then it's like, as reasonable as that determination might be, you've also blocked from view all of its other dimensions and possibilities. And I think this obsession with, we, let's just say, as intellectuals and human beings, we supposedly want to know, right? Like all men desire, we want knowledge. We want to end our confusion. But we don't just want that. We want to be the knower. We want to be the one who knows. But I think the idea of honesty is that you have to sort of see through yourself and be suspicious of your own motivations and you can't just remain yourself and expect to find the treasure. It's like, if it's not paradise, if you bring you into
that's what most people want, is to eat their cake and have it too. How can I become enlightened but still be
I guess you have to be
that I enjoy.
You have to be the cake. You have to eat yourself. That's actually what Bobby uses that figure in his little story about the mischievous chicken, which is this sort of a little bit like Plato's cave, but this chicken that leaves the roost, that leaves the security of the mother's wing. And anyway, it goes on this. It's a sort of fable of the evolution of consciousness. But you get to a point, which I guess Baba describes as the sixth plane, where you see God or truth or reality everywhere, but there still remains this separate self, right? And so the last thing that has to go is your attachment to your individual mind and your personal ego. So in a sense, you have to eat yourself at that very end.
That's where we're ending up. Is we're all going to become God by eating ourselves. Is that? I mean, that seems.
Well, the soul body. I mean, that's what the soul is literally eating the body. I mean, that's an old figure. We could talk about it. It goes back to Aristotle. This sort of decay of the. But anyway, the corpse is like, excrement. Basically, we've fed on it. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. You had
no. Well, alongside that, the fact we're all going to end up there by eating ourselves. I mean, Baba, it is inherent that, though maybe this is where I don't have as much faith for him, is that we're all seekers. It is inherent in our nature that we seek. Seek God realization, which is difficult to square with people you see in supermarkets or whatever, but I assume there's like earlier stages of being a human, maybe. Not saying that we're elite or anything.
Well, obviously, there's many different ways of being human, and human nature is. I mean, that's the other thing, that if we understand evolution to be individualized, which is. Actually, I don't know. I'm not up on evolutionary science, but I mean, people are starting to understand that it's not just through mating and selection, but that experience, right, alters the gene code. I mean, what happens to the individual organism, and then, so there is a pathway between individual experience and the general evolution. But for me, it's really critical to appreciate that everything is individual. Everything is. It's not just that you are a human with a number of accidental features, that constitute your personality or something, but you really are an individual creation of the whole history of everything. And the creator of that history. But yeah, Mir Baba says that everyone, consciously or unconsciously, is seeking themselves. I mean, what else are people?
It's a very optimistic theology, and even if I remember,
There's no damnation. There's no one to be. There's no one to save.
So my understanding was there is a heaven and hell, which is after you die, and it's experiences that. So, but there's states. This is for Baba, of course. They're states, and they are states that are built from the experiences that you've accumulated, let's say. But obviously, once your body is gone, you don't have the physicality to feel them, so you only feel them in the mental or and
subtle,
subtle sense. So it's far more intense, I guess, until those states have been burnt out.
The idea is that after the soul drops the body, it dies. It no longer has the medium of the physical body. And you see this represented in like movies and the idea of a life review, it's in this subjective and more, like you say, more intensive sort of experience, because it's experiencing its own impressions without the medium of the body. So we can imagine emotional pains and things that are that much more intense, and sometimes I think we do have intense dreams, that are like, wow, they seem a kind of intensity that you don't necessarily experience in the gross world. But that's the idea that is a subjective and temporary state of, you could think of it as purgatory, as a kind of state of purification, a balancing out of the balance of, of your impressions. And the idea is that, if you've you get what you give. So you certain kinds of experiences, noble, good experiences, lead to the heaven state, and then you have the hell state. But it's all just a temporary.
You learn your lessons.
Passage. Yeah, I mean, you're trying to. The soul is trying to orient itself with regard to its experience, and I guess locate itself in some way. You can think about it. In the discourses, it talks about that process.
So it almost seems like nothing is to be done other than to live and to be intrigued and to experience and to inquire.
Yeah, which sounds like everything is to be done. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, what does Meher Baba want people to do? He emphasized, of course, love. He wrote some very eloquent, beautiful things about. He has a text that's called "How to Love God," right, and it's very much focused on practicing tolerance and striving to make others happy. One statement, he says something, well, there's two ways. You either just renounce everything and really you just go into a cave and you just abandon, which is essentially the monastic path in the old form. That's one way to find God. And the other is just to live a normal life, a worldly life, but to be honest and to practice, love and honesty. He didn't, as far as religion goes, he did not advise against people abandoning their religion. He wasn't, and he was explicit about not wanting to establish any kind of new religion. But the only thing that mattered, as he stated, was basically just the living of the truth of one's faith, which he said all religions have the same essence. So this kind of social, cultural religion doesn't seem to have much of a place in Meher Baba's.
No.
Yeah,
Is there anything?
but it's not canceled either. It's just yeah.
Yeah. It's a very. Has it grown as whatever this is taken root? I guess it's tough. I know. I think I understand. There's centers and there's groups and stuff, but has it taken root as maybe even just a force in the world?
A force in the world? Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Everything in the world has some effects and influence, but there's no organized. There's lots of different kinds of Baba lovers and Baba likers and people who are, and there's a place of pilgrimage, Meher Baba's tomb, and many thousands of people around the world, chiefly from India, go there on the anniversary of his death. Yeah, from different faiths too, But and in the West, I mean, in the 30s, Meher Baba traveled in America and Europe, and he's had both Eastern and Western disciples, if you will. So yeah, I mean, there's been some academic work on sort of sociology of Meher Baba movement and things, and there's different kinds of groups, and in America there's a what's called the Meher Spiritual Center in South Carolina, which was a place where he stayed on his trips to America. It's a kind of retreat center.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about Baba that you feel is?
Oh, there's a lot. Yeah, I have a lot. I'd love to. Yeah, I've never. I've never had the opportunity to talk like in this sort of podcast context about Meher Baba. I'm always quoting Baba, and and I've been reading the discourses, like I said, and particularly that text, for a long time now. So I feel like it remains fresh and new to me every time I go back to it. It's like, wow, how come I haven't seen that passage before? I just maybe a few things to emphasize. We talked about honesty. We talked about love. We talked about individuality. I also wrote a book that's coming out recently called The Seriality of the One, which is kind of deploys that idea of seriality that I mentioned. But the spontaneity, I think, is another key term that's really interesting to trace across Baba's writings, not just because of the idea of the whim of, cosmic evolution, kind of the beginning of everything. But when he talks about the nature of love, for example, he talks about how love has to spring, it can't be coerced. It has to spring spontaneously from within. And I know our last conversation years ago was about the will, and spontaneity and the will are very much, kind of aligned. So I just think that's, and it remains a kind of mysterious thing in terms of evolution, in terms of the emergence of life, there's nature seems to just have this imminent thing within itself, this capacity to make a leap, or maybe it's like the old idea of the swerve, going back to Lucretius, the sort of unaccountable divergence. And Meher Baba's style of being and his manner, the way he would change his dress and suddenly do this and suddenly do that. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he lived that spontaneity in a striking way. So that's just something that I think is worth emphasizing. But just leave it at that. I mean, there's a lot more there's always more to discuss. Do you have any other questions or
where would you advise people to begin? God speaks.
No, I wouldn't advise people. I mean, of course, just read whatever appeals to you. But I think the discourses are the most, I mean, they're very kind of limpid, clear, covers all topics that Baba likes to talk about. The discourse, preferably in the 6th edition or the revised 6th edition. Also, the Everything and the Nothing is a really nice collection of statements. Very small book. Beams from Meher Baba. Everything is on at the Avatar Meher Baba Trust. All these works, most of them are online in PDF form. Also, listening, there's just sort of infinite fund of stories about Baba's life and history. There's a whole, now it's online archive of what are called Mandali talks, which are just talks that were given by his close disciples. Those can be very interesting to listen to because you have, firsthand accounts of daily life and it's also a great long poem written by the Australian poet Francis Brabazon, Stay with God, which also gives a kind of beautiful, this is a sort of epic work of praise, but also kind of does a whole inventory of Western culture and critique of the world from the perspective of a disciple of Meher Baba. But if somebody wants to read, I would say The Discourses would be my first recommendation. But that's the first book that I first really got into. So maybe I'm just projecting.
Okay. And you're now working on the seriality of one. And you're now working on the seriality of one.
Oh, that's done. Yeah, it's just sort of a shorter book that goes into this idea of seriality.
Okay.
But it's not. Yeah, it's not. The book's not about Meher Baba, but it again deploys Baba words.
Okay. What else are you working on now?
Well, my next project, which I've just started fleshing out, is going to be about sweetness and pleasure. I've been teaching a class on pleasure a few times now, and I'm just really interested in what has happened to this old idea that reality is fundamentally pleasurable, sweet, blissful. So I think it's going to be called Eternal Sweetness.
Okay.
But and it's all. I'm also interested in decay, actually, which the nature of decay, and it also has a connection with sweetness, but and sickly sweetness, I guess. But so that's what the next project is.
Okay. Do you have a site? I can't remember.
I do have a blog that's the whim.blogspot.com, which has been up for a long time now. I have an academia page.
Okay.
And, and the faculty page at Brooklyn College, that sort of thing.
Cool. Well, I'll be sure to put both of those links in the description below, but I think that's a good place to finish up.
Okay. That was a really enjoyable conversation, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much.